Hi, I'm Juliette Harrisson. I write, perform, and produce the podcast Creepy Classics. At the podcast, I retell ancient, medieval, and early modern ghost stories in a modern short story format, and then I have a bit of a chat about the historical context of the story. The video you're about to watch is one of the stories. It's actually the very first episode of Creepy Classics, this one. And this is just the story, complete with some images that I've put together from my own photograph collection, just to give you a taster of the kind of thing that I do over at Creepy Classics. So if you like what you hear, then please do head on over to the podcast itself and check out the historical context chat and all the other episodes. Or just listen to this story and enjoy. This story has been adapted from the 2nd century CE novel Metamorphoses by Apuleius, sometimes known as the Golden Ass, Book 9, chapters 29 to 31.
The story of the miller's wife. On the very edge of town, so close to the graves that she could smell them, a woman hesitated outside a small hovel. She reached into her cloak and removed a tiny hidden necklace in the shape of a letter T, which she kissed and put away in a coin purse. Nervously patting her elaborately styled hair, she knocked, waited for an answering call, and ducked inside. The hovel's only occupant sat at a tall table, writing labels on a series of dull, dirty jars. Her dark hair was wild and unkempt, and as her visitor peered in horror through the shadows, she saw a flash of snakeskin ripple through the greying curls. The woman's funereal black dress matched the grime and smoke stains that covered her tiny home. A basket at her feet held a collection of crude dolls made of wood, wax, and lead. Another by the table contained a pile of papyrus scrolls. "Well, this is a surprise," said the black-clad woman, and her voice was surprisingly normal. "I know you, the miller's wife. You don't believe in the gods." "I believe in one god," her visitor mumbled awkwardly, "but that's not why I'm here." "Obviously." The witch sat back in her chair and patted her lap for her black cat to leap up to her. But the cat was having none of it and stayed put in his bed. "I've heard you can enchant men's minds," continued the nervous monotheist. "Make them believe what you want them to. Make them think differently." "Sometimes," came the reply. "Usually, women come to me because they want men to fall in love with them, or to fall out of love with them and leave them alone. Which is it?" "I want my husband to forgive me," said the visitor. "Ah, that's trickier." There was a silence until the woman realized she was supposed to be filling it. "He caught my lover. The boy's just a kid, really, even younger than me, not by much. His beard is mostly fluff. My husband announced that since we share everything, we should share the boy too. Took him away for the rest of the night. Then in the morning he had him whipped and threw me out into the street with a note of divorce." "I see," said the witch, poking around in her pile of scrolls. "So you want your husband to love you again?" "I want him to forgive me," said the woman. "I want him to take me back. I want him to be blind to my lovers, like he was before," said the witch, heaving her breath out of her mouth. "I can try, but no promises." She pulled out one of the wax dolls and held it up for inspection. "Love is easy, you see," she said, holding it towards the visitor. "Most people say love. What they really mean is sex. Bit of heat here," she gestured to the doll's private parts. "A little heat here and here. gesturing to its heart and head. "That's all anyone really wants. Besides, the lover is generally fairly besotted themselves, and that helps. But you're not. You don't really want him, you just want to live in his house. And you don't want love or lust, you want forgiveness, which is much harder." The woman turned away for a moment, biting her lip. Then she seemed to come to some decision. "If you can't make him forgive me," she said, "if you can't make him take me back, I want him gone." "You want him to leave town?" There was a glint in the witch's eye. She knew that wasn't her visitor's meaning. "I want him dead," the woman replied. "Now that," said the witch with a smile, "I can do." In the heat of the day, slaves and animals together trudged weary circles, grinding flour at the mill. A small group of overseers strolled the grounds, free of tethers, wielding whips and canes. The canes were for the mules and donkeys, which, blindfolded, were spurred on to go round and round and round, eternally pulling the millstone like an endless spinning top. The whips were for the human slaves who worked alongside the animals. Branded on their foreheads to make sure they could not run away, clothed in a skimpy bit of loincloth per man, most of the slaves were shackled to their posts, their backs crisscrossed with welts from the lash. A layer of fine white flour had settled onto the sweat on their skin, giving them an eerie and otherworldly appearance. They did not speak, they barely breathed. A moment's hesitation and the lash came down again, even more easily than the cane was put to the animals. The animals were worth more. Lucius, the house slave, scurried across the grounds of the mill with a note for his master. He was nervous. The message was yet another plea for mercy from the mistress. He shuddered as he passed close to an overseer in the act of raising his whip to strike one of the mill slaves. Lucius paused to take a breath a few feet away from where the miller sat at a high table going over his accounts. A stir, and the unusual sound of the slaves' voices raised to a low murmur made both of them look up towards the gate. A woman had walked into the mill. Not the mistress. This was a woman none present had ever seen before. And nor did they want to again, for the woman was clearly in a state of intense distress. Like a defendant in court who wants to arouse the sympathy of the jury by making themselves look as tired, stressed, and pathetic as possible, she appeared in an appallingly dishevelled state. But she seemed to have gone too far for even the most easily moved jury to be able to stand to look at her. She was barefoot and half-clothed in rags. Skin more unnaturally white than the slaves' flour-coated bodies showed through what was left of her dress. She looked starving, and her head hung down, her loose hair hanging in tangled clumps across her face. What could be seen of her expression was unutterably, unbearably sad, as if nothing in the world could ever be right again. She had poured ashes over her head, and a grey trail of muck and soot tumbled down from her matted hair like blood. She started to walk towards the miller at his desk. Her movements were stilted and awkward, her body hunched over and her feet dragging as if every step caused her pain. Lucius shrank back in revulsion, but his master seemed transfixed. Every other man in the grounds was gaping at her in horror, but the miller's reaction was quite different. He gazed at the woman as if she were the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen. A small smile played about his lips as he let his stylus fall and slowly stood up to greet her. His eyes were soft, softer than Lucius had ever seen them, and certainly softer than they had ever been when he looked at his wife. He seemed oblivious to the shock of his slaves or the quiet muttering that was silenced only by the crack of the whip. He had eyes only for this woman. Finally, the woman finished making her slow, limping way over to the miller. Her head was hanging, but she seemed to try to turn it coquettishly, her strangled hair falling back to reveal one bloodshot eye. The miller's smile widened, and he looked at her hungrily. She leaned over and whispered something in his ear, laying a single hand on his arm. He smiled some more. Gently, she drew her hand down his arm to lace her brittle fingers in his and lead him across the yard to his own bedroom. After a moment or two of silence, the overseers cracked their whips once more, and the endless grinding work of the mill began again. Lucius, his message undelivered, paused a moment before scurrying away, out of the range of the lash. Several times that afternoon, Lucius tried to return to deliver the message to his master, but every time he was told the same thing. The master had not yet emerged from his bedroom, and nor had the mysterious woman. As evening fell and the heat of the summer day finally shifted from fiery sun's rays to the close warmth of the darkness, Lucius returned once more, to find the yard half deserted. The chained slaves and animals were still there, but they sat on the ground, most of them laying their heads back and resting their eyes. Lucius followed the sounds of men arguing and something banging to the master's bedroom, where he found the overseers huddled around the doorway. They had been calling the master for some time, it seemed, and there had been no answer. They had knocked and were still knocking, but there was no response, and no sound from within. "We should break the door down!" cried one. "Are you mad?" demanded another. "Damage the master's property? Not to mention disturbing him while he's alone with a young woman? We'll all be crucified!" "You didn't see the woman, mate," another told him. "If it was a woman, I think it was a demon sent from Hades. No woman should look like that." "My sister looked like that when they buried her," muttered another. "Gods damn the woman," spat the first man. "To Hades with her. We need the master. There's no more grain to grind. And if you think he'll be happy about us just stopping work and downing tools, you've got another think coming. He'll crucify us for that, sure as you like." A lot of general murmuring suggested that the first overseer had a point. "Fine," agreed the second overseer eventually. "But don't break the door down. Don't damage property any more than you have to. Break the hinges if you must, but leave the door intact." Lucius leant forward to help two of the overseers to pry the door hinges apart and lift the door itself free of them. That meant he got a full, clear view of what lay on the other side of the door. The miller hung from a beam in the roof, dead. He had obviously been dead for hours, and a slight smell had started to rise from his body in the heat. The strange woman was nowhere to be seen. Immediately the overseers began to wail and beat their chests in a show of grief. Perhaps for them the grief was real. They had a cushy position in the mill, might not be so lucky with the new master. Lucius backed away and brought the news to the shackled slaves sitting in the flour dust outside. They simply looked at him once and closed their eyes again. Not one of them dared to allow a glimmer of hope that their next master might be better. The sticky heat of the summer evening closing in, the overseers ordered the chained slaves to dig a grave quickly and buried the miller with little ceremony. Lucius went to bed, the wife's letter still in his pouch. The next morning, the household's attempt to sleep late was disturbed by the sound of a woman's wail approaching from the street. Nervous, the slaves gathered in the yard, the overseers clutching their whips and their canes. But this was no reappearance of the mysterious woman from the day before. It was the miller's daughter, who had run all the way from the next village over where she lived with her husband. No one wanted to have to tell her what had happened to her father, but no one had to, for it seemed she already knew. The young woman had loosed her hair for mourning, and was beating her breasts and keening a funeral dirge. For a little while she simply sat by the makeshift grave, and continued to offer her wailing and her self-flagellation in grief at her father's passing. But she was stirred to action when a familiar face appeared among the growing crowd outside the mill. The miller's wife had come for the reply to her message, still buried in Lucius' pouch. When she realized what she was witnessing, she tried to pull away, but too late. Her stepdaughter had seen her. "Wicked harpy!" screamed the young woman, throwing herself at her stepmother, once her childhood friend, attacking her with teeth and nails. "Harlot! Whore! Spawn of Clytemnestra! You have killed my father!" And she broke down, weeping. "Dear one, what are you talking about?" exclaimed the wife, appearing to be genuinely shocked and confused. "I saw him!" cried the daughter through her tears. "I saw him! Late last night, in the dark, in my bedroom he came to me. I saw his face pale, his eyes bulging, his throat bruised from the noose that was still around his neck. He could not have spoken with any human voice, but from the depth of his soul he told me everything." Who came to you?" Lucius could hear the crowd repeating the question all around the street. "My father. He said he divorced you for adultery, but you would not accept it. You went to that witch on the edge of town." Here she scanned the crowd, but the black-clad woman was not among them. "You ordered his death. The witch sent a spirit to fetch him and drag him down to the underworld." At this, the daughter threw her whole body at her stepmother and beat the other woman to the ground, pummeling her with her fists and scratching at her eyes. All the while, the stepmother screeched her desperate denials, but none believed her. All were convinced by the daughter's grief and fury. Finally, the mill slaves pulled their master's daughter away and held her back. Shakily, bruised and bleeding, the miller's wife got to her feet. "I'll come back in now," she said quietly. "We need to carry out the proper mourning rituals, and then divide the estate." The daughter laughed a hard, cold laugh. "There's no use pretending, bitch. My father divorced you. And even if he hadn't, you were married without Manus. This house, this mill, everything in it," she glanced around at the slaves and the animals, "is mine. Get out. I never want to see you again." The miller's wife looked for help among the crowd, but found none. Hesitantly, she drew out her little T-shaped necklace and held it forward to some particular bystanders she seemed to recognize, displaying it like a token, but they turned their faces away and pretended not to know her. Finally, she limped away, her walk no less stilted and uncertain than the apparition that had appeared to her husband the day before. For 9 days, the traditional mourning rites were observed. On the 10th day, the daughter took control of her inheritance. She wanted nothing more to do with the place that had seen the death of her father. Every slave and every pack animal in the mill was sold.